I really appreciate you coming here on this rocky day. I may be hanging on to the lectern a little more tightly than usual, but you'll understand, I'm sure. So first, before I start, a quick word about this map. I saw some people kind of puzzling over, like, what is this map? So it is not a map that is used in China, but it was designed to show how the world might look from China's point of view. So the Tibet is down in the bottom, looking out over most of China, and how it might look from their point of view, eastward towards the Pacific. So I just found this map to be a really good metaphor for my talk today, because what I'm hoping to do is to help you understand China's perspective on the world based on history, which has shaped its worldview and values, and to better understand how that shapes its ambitions. So today is the first of a series of the first 3 talks that I'll be giving are on contemporary China, its values, its economy, and its technology. And my whole focus is to help you gain a better understanding of China today. But first, I'd like to start with a story. So do you see the baby in this photo? That's my husband, who's in the second row, Paul Yang. He was born in China in 1938, which was a very bad year in China. It was just as the Japanese troops were marching across his country, brutally taking city after city. His father was an officer for the Chinese army and had just survived the Battle of Shanghai, which was a terrible defeat. And he was being transferred with his wife to a safer inland city in an area not occupied by the Japanese. And Paul's parents took a train to get there, and just as they were pulling into the station of their destination, his mother, who was pregnant, went into labor. They rushed off the train, and his panicky father ran around the square asking questions. Was there a hospital? Was there a clinic? And they found a clinic not far away, but the clinic said they wouldn't treat her because she wasn't a wounded soldier, because it was wartime, and they were prioritizing wounded soldiers. And his father said, well, I'm a military officer, but please, could you help me? And fortunately, they made an exception, and they helped her give birth to a baby boy, who grew up to be Paul. So war lasted throughout his childhood, and Paul has terrifying memories of nights when the family had to get up in the middle of the night and run to a bomb shelter in the dark because Japanese bombers were strafing the city. And the Japanese army occupied much of China for 8 years before the war ended. And then a civil war began between China's communists and the government. And when Paul was 10, his family had to flee again. They flee south to escape from that fighting. And just a year later, they made it to Shanghai, but the communist army was getting very close to Shanghai, and many of the troops, as you know, were moving on to Taiwan. And his father managed to get 4 airplane tickets for their small family to fly to safety in Taiwan for the next day. But they were on 2 separate flights. Sophie's choice, right? And Paul's family faced this wrenching choice. Which 2 of them would go on the first flight? Because they could hear the guns in the distance, and they knew that at any moment the flights might stop. So Paul's father was most in danger, so he went first with Paul's younger sister. And then the thinking was that if they did get separated and the second plane didn't go off, Paul, who was 11 years old at the time, could stay behind and take care of his mother. So just imagine what that might have been like. And after Paul's father left, Paul and his mother waited at the airport, their anxiety building, and they could hear gunfire in the distance, not knowing if the second flight would be able to take off or not. But it did. And they landed safely in Taiwan. And the communists did take the Shanghai airport and cancel all flights out the very next day. So Paul's story is a nail-biter, but it's far from unique. During those turbulent years, many millions of Chinese people fled their homeland, moving to Taiwan, Hong Kong, or overseas. Perhaps some of you yourself have experienced this or know someone who did. And they were forced to start life anew with almost no possessions. And after that, Paul and his family lived in peace in Taiwan. He finished high school and college, and then he emigrated to the United States. So life was stable. And I realized that there are Europeans and Asians who have similar terrifying memories of bombing and occupation during the war. But US-born Americans like me do not. The last time foreign armies invaded the US and occupied territory was, any guesses? 1812. It was long before any of our lifetimes. So in the living memory of all Americans today, wars have always been fought in faraway countries. Now, of course, we have experienced instability and, yes, horrifying one-time attacks like Pearl Harbor and 9/11, but nothing in our national experience compares to the constant fear and disruption over many years that Paul and his generation of Chinese lived through. So marrying Paul and learning about his childhood story really gave me some deep insights into China's values and worldview, which I plan to share with you today. But first, though, just a few words about my approach to this topic. I was trained as a journalist to be objective and to report on many different points of view. And also, as you can tell from my accent, I'm American, and I see through American eyes. But I believe it's important for all of us to try to understand how the Chinese in China see the world. If we don't, we'll never overcome our differences. So that's what motivated me to choose this topic today, China's worldview, values, and ambitions, and also the question, if China becomes the next superpower, what kind might it be? So let's jump into a momentous time in my life. In 1982, in September of that year, just 3 months after I arrived in Hong Kong as Business Week's bureau chief, I embarked on a reporting trip to 5 different cities in China, ending in Beijing. I was 28 years old. I was just getting my feet wet, trying to figure out how on earth to cover the biggest country in the world, which was newly opening after being a closed and isolated country. And while I was in Beijing, someone else got there too. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher arrived to start the talks with China's top leader, Deng Xiaoping, on the future of Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, those talks set off a wave of anxiety. Hong Kong's real estate and stock markets dropped, so I jumped into action. After all, I was a business reporter. It was dramatic news for me to cover. But much later, reflecting on those events, I noticed something that really struck me. China's top leader, Deng, promised Hong Kong stability and prosperity. Stability and prosperity. Those words just kind of stuck with me, and frankly, as an American, I was puzzled. And over the 40-plus years since that I've been in and out of China, I've realized that those words were more than just a promise to Hong Kong. They're core Chinese values. Now, prosperity is easy for us to understand. We all want our countries to prosper. But stability, of course, we in the West want it too, but most of us don't see that as a core value. Stability is something we Americans take for granted. Chinese don't. So when asked, most Americans would say our top values among them are freedom and democracy, and what else? Values that we have. But looking at China today, many Americans don't see a reflection of our values. And so for the last decade, we in the United States have been led to see China in a black and white, autocracy versus democracy framework. But China does have values. For the last decade, but it's just that they're distinctly different from ours in the West. And they're based not so much on communism as on China's history, which differs greatly from ours. So it's my hope that if we, Westerners, outsiders, can better understand Beijing's values and perspective, we can develop a more productive and pragmatic approach. So recent presidents all view China as a strategic rival at best, so it's extra important that we understand why China's leaders speak and act the way they do. And if we don't, if we just assume they'll act the same way US leaders do, or if we project on them the same motives as, say, Putin, we risk serious miscalculation. If instead we try to understand their worldview and values, we'll be better prepared. So, are you with me? Let's go. So first, let's get back to stability. Why is stability so important to China's leaders? So as you heard from the story of my husband's childhood, China's recent history was a time of instability. In the lifetimes of some of us alive today, like him, China suffered through years of terrible wars, lasting all the way from 1937 to 1949. Massacre, starvation, displacement. Tens of millions of refugees had to flee from their ancestral homes. And those years were particularly awful. But even before that, China suffered through 30 years of instability under weak governments. In 1911, the emperor was overthrown, and the successors tried to set up a form of democratic representative government, but the country fell into chaos. So for decades, China was this weird patchwork of regional warlords, each fighting each other over territory. The pink and purple blobs here show areas controlled by different warlords, but it really should be a video because it was changing all the time. And that, too, was a chaotic and distressing time for people living in China. And when Chiang Kai-shek took power as generalissimo, he tried to restore order and reunify the country. But that involved fighting against warlords in province after province. And the communists arose during that period of turmoil. So after the Communist Party won in 1949, peace was restored. But those who stayed in China, as most Chinese did, and those born after 1949 lived through further political disruptions. So after all those decades of chaos, Deng's promise of stability and prosperity resonated with Chinese, including the people of Hong Kong. Many of them were refugees or descendants of refugees from China's turbulent 19th and 20th centuries. Since 1979, when Deng Xiaoping returned to power, China has not fought a single war in 46 years. That might surprise you. Since 1979, China has not fought in a war. So China's leaders today say their top goal is common prosperity. And you can only have that when the country is at peace and the government is stable. So this gets to a second value that I wanted to highlight. Because of all of this, the Chinese value a strong central government. So to many of us in the West, that's a little hard to hear. Many Americans distrust the idea of strong government. We were founded as a republic, after all, with power shared by cities and states, and there's a suspicion of government overreach. So most Americans embrace the idea that government power needs to be limited through strong checks and balances. The Chinese don't understand this mentality at all. It's a generalization, I realize, but I would venture to say that most Chinese citizens prefer a strong central government. So why is that? China has thousands of years of history with multiple dynasties, but one pattern is really clear. During periods of strong government, ordinary people thrived. During years of plenty, the central government would build up stores of grain, and then during years of drought or floods, the government would open the storehouses and feed the people. But in periods of weak government, Chinese people saw the opposite: chaos, war, bandits, starvation. So, of course, it's not enough for a ruler just to be strong. The Chinese ideal is a ruler who is both strong and wise, one who takes care of his people and brings about peace and prosperity for all. This emperor was famous for that. So China's leader, Deng Xiaoping, returned the country to relative stability. And China's leaders since then have maintained peace and pursued common prosperity, giving amazing opportunities to its citizens to work their way out of poverty. And this has brought a good life, not just to a small elite, but to many hundreds of millions of Chinese. When Chinese citizens look at democracies around the world, frankly, they don't see a lot of stability. In Chinese experience, people live better lives when the central government is strong and wise. So today, the Chinese benefit from a strong central government that not only ensures peace and stability, but also invests heavily in their future. Many travelers have asked me, how did China afford all this growth that we see around us? Look at Shenzhen. How did China afford all of that? Tall buildings, subways, trains. Most developing countries can't afford that. The answer has several parts, including personal savings rates and state revenue from land sales and profits from state-owned companies, but also from all those exports that over the decades that generated a lot of revenue for Chinese companies. And as you can see here, China's foreign exchange reserves have fallen slightly in the last 10 years, but they remain above $3 trillion, which is the highest foreign exchange reserves of any country in the world. And China's been able to reinvest those earnings and build up its infrastructure. So while lots of other developing countries suffered from mismanagement and corruption, China's strong central government over the last 40 years proved overall, from their perspective, to be wise. So third, consistent with stability and strong central government, the Chinese value harmony. You've heard this before. But when it comes to a choice between social harmony and individual human rights, they tend to prefer harmony. So some say this comes from their agricultural past, when villagers had to work together, especially in the rice fields. They were interdependent and communal. No farmer could make it on his own. But harmony is also central to the teachings of Confucius, whose system of personal ethics shaped China for 2,500 years. Confucius taught a strictly hierarchical and patriarchal system of personal values. Children obey their parents. Younger brothers obey their older brothers. Wives obey their husbands. Children obey their rulers. Citizens obey their rulers. So at the top of the pyramid was the emperor, the one ruler that everyone obeyed. So to us in the West, sounds like a lot of obeying, doesn't it? It makes us a little bit uncomfortable. But the flip side of it was that the rulers and the fathers and the husbands were also trained to take good care of those people, their subjects. So today, some people in China respect Confucianism, others reject certain aspects of it, but there's no question that these values continue to influence the values today. Many Chinese prefer a patriarchal government and expect it to take care of them. By contrast, we in the West value individualism and individual human rights. Americans in particular have embraced the lone cowboy image and that of the self-made man. And in foreign policy, remember Eleanor Roosevelt? That value means that we in the West place a high value on defending individual human rights. So ever since the end of the Holocaust, the defense of human rights has been a central tenet of U.S. foreign policy, at least in principle. And in recent years, the U.S. has used its power to sanction foreign leaders and freeze bank transfers of people in other countries if we think that they are violating individual rights. And our leaders have also used those powers to punish foreign officials for behavior inside their own countries that Washington sees as abuses of human rights. And the Chinese government, among others, resents this as interference in their internal affairs. And they argue that basic human rights include the right to food, shelter, education, health care, and that they have sought to provide those rights to all. So to many Chinese, and not just the government, it's important to put overall stability above the personal freedom of individuals. But of course, that's not the way we see it in the West. Quite the opposite. Our values are as deeply held as theirs, and that sometimes leads to irreconcilable differences. But wait, if Chinese are all into kumbaya, communal welfare, rather than individualism, how come so many Chinese as individuals are so highly competitive? Does that sound familiar? This question has puzzled me. It's obvious by now that despite decades of communism, people in China took to private enterprise in a big way, right? And isn't private enterprise all about sort of individual ambition? I would say this relates to a fourth Chinese value I wanted to discuss today, which is pride. First, a word about pride. This is my husband in his younger days. When he moved to the US from Taiwan for graduate school in the 1960s, China was so poor and backward that he was almost embarrassed to tell people that he was Chinese. Almost, not quite. When I was a child in Ohio, I don't know about any of you, if I didn't finish all the food on my plate, my parents would say, "Finish that food. Think of all the starving children in..." Did any of you have parents like mine? A few, not everybody. So today, now that China's strong, Paul, who's been a U.S. citizen for more than 50 years, feels a clear and understandable sense of pride in the accomplishments of his homeland. And I think you'll be hearing a lot of that pride among our tour guides as we travel along China's coast. Overall, though, what Chinese pride often translates into is hard work, striving to be the best, and, yes, hyper-competitiveness. So anyone who's ever witnessed a Chinese tiger mom pushing their kids to do better in school will recognize this. This woman is a Chinese American, a professor at Yale Law School, who wrote a book called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. And from what I've heard from a few of our Viking tour guides, tiger moms and dads inside China today are even more demanding than she was. So, how to explain this apparent contradiction in China's values between group harmony and individual competitiveness? So for thousands of years, the way for Chinese men to get power and prestige was to become a government official. And the only way to do that was to study for the imperial examinations. There was a whole series of exams based on very specific texts that every educated man was required to study and memorize and master. And only those who passed up to a certain degree would be eligible to hold a certain position in government. Credentials mattered. Hierarchy was strict. No matter how well connected a man was, he could not advance to the next level if he didn't pass the next level of exams. Now, wealthy parents did what wealthy parents do, and they hired private tutors for their sons. But even poor villagers would pool their resources and hire teachers for the local farmers' sons, just in case one of them was smart enough that he could actually get himself up to a high level. And families boasted for generations if even one of their own rose to a certain level of official. It was a major source of family pride. So competitiveness was baked into the system, which is a meritocracy. Today in China, can you imagine being one of those kids? I feel bad for them. There is one national exam for everyone who wants to enter any university, and students are ranked accordingly. So of course, every student strives to do really well on it. Getting a high score brings pride to the whole family. So today, almost all government officials start working, this is interesting and not true in our country, at the local level, in the city or county governments. And then the best of them work their way up to the provincial government, and the best of them work up to the national government. So most high-level leaders in Beijing today have experience as a leader first in cities and provinces. And Chinese are very proud of this system, and frankly, look with disdain on political systems where inexperienced people can run for political office. They think the best rulers are those who have risen through the ranks, proving themselves through exams and gaining experience. So that's one of their core values. This gets us to China's current president, Xi Jinping, and the vision he created for building a rejuvenated China. He wants China to regain its former status where it was admired as the best. And of course, Americans cannot imagine a world where our country is not the best. That's a very simplistic way, I realize. But in my view, that's kind of at the core of why US-China relations have deteriorated so quickly over the last few years. So until recently, China was like the younger brother, always learning from the West, the older brother. And American business folks were happy to say, well, let me show you how to build a great factory or build this product. But now, Chinese have started doing some things better than we do, and we are not liking that so much. So for instance, in 2019, Tesla opened a mega factory to make electric cars in Shanghai. And at that time, the local competition in electric cars he just laughed at it. He looked at a local Chinese-made electric car and said, that's crazy. And it just seemed impossible that China could ever compete with Tesla. But now, 6 years later, there's a Chinese company called BYD, which alone makes more electric vehicles than Tesla worldwide. And its quality of its cars are highly regarded. So overall, in some technologies, China threatens to overtake the West. In manufacturing, it already has, in many fields. And also in some areas of advanced technology. I have a whole lecture on this in a couple of days. So anyway, in my personal view, these sort of who's ahead types of comparisons are mostly just about bragging rights. Like two overachieving students in the same class, the US and China both strive to be the best. And that's understandable. That's called competition. But it does not have to lead to military confrontation. And it's not an existential threat, at least in my personal view. By valuing pride, China doesn't mean dominance or superiority or hegemony, replacing the US as a world superpower. What Chinese want is the ability to forge their own path forward without interference or coercion from the US or any other nation. They want to compete fairly without a Tanya Harding move where the rival smashes them on the knees to prevent them from competing. This gets to the next value, coexistence and non-intervention. So what does that even mean? First, some background. As far back as 1953, China's premier, Zhou Enlai, enunciated something he called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which included mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. And these principles formed a basis for something that was then called the non-aligned movement back in the 60s. And it also undergirds China's approach to the world today. So peaceful coexistence and non-intervention. But fast forward to today, when Beijing refused to condemn Putin for his invasion of Ukraine, many of us in the West were shocked. Of course, part of the reason may be that for China's so-called neutrality maybe is geopolitics and self-interest. China has a long border with Russia, and it benefits from friendly relations with its biggest neighbor, especially as the US has grown more hostile. But it's also an example of China's desire to coexist with its neighbor and not intervene to try to change Moscow's policies or actions. So in recent years, I've heard some Americans criticize China's foreign policy as being values-free. In other words, China will trade equally with brutal dictatorships and well-managed democracies. And its critics say that China is transactional, self-interested, and just focused on business deals. But China's leaders view it differently. They say that China respects the development path and social system chosen independently by people in each country and doesn't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. In other words, don't try regime change on us. So it's true that China thinks that other developing countries could learn from its economic model, building infrastructure first, and then that then enables the private sector growth. But China doesn't want any foreign country to impose its form of government or its economic development on China. So Beijing doesn't impose its values or its political system on other countries either. So this approach to non-intervention stems from China's unique history. So bear with me here. These two maps show China in 200 BC and again in the early 1800s. For more than 2,000 years, China has seen itself as one large continental country unified under one ruler. Sure, occasionally it fell apart. Civil wars, peasant rebellions, revolutionary turmoil. But throughout history, China has always pulled itself together again. And for most of history, China's neighbors were not rival powers equally strong. Now, it is true that both the Mongols and the Manchus conquered China, but then they set up their own dynasties in Beijing and blended into the Chinese system. So throughout the centuries, China saw itself as the central power. China's army, for the most part, was stationed along the Great Wall, protecting the homeland from occasional raids by nomads from the north. So my point is, until the arrival of the Europeans in the 1800s, China never saw itself as competing with equally powerful rivals. But by contrast, look at Europe. I was actually a European history major, and I never thought of it in this way back in those days. I find it fascinating to compare the history of China with that of Europe, because if you think about it, from the Greek Empire to the Persians, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine, and the Arab conquests, and the Holy Roman Empire, Europe's history has been one of rivalry and the rising and falling of empires based in different places. And each fought against rivals for territory and power and prestige. But that contrasts sharply with China's experience. Also, China never got into the whole game of colonization. No Chinese emperor ever dreamed of sending troops far out into the world to conquer territories and set up colonies. In fact, in only one dynasty did China develop a large navy. Under this guy, an admiral named Zheng He. Your Viking historian, Grant Road, is going to be giving a whole lecture about it, and I encourage you to learn more about him. But Zheng He's navy was huge, in fact, much larger than any in Europe. And that began in the early 1400s, so almost 100 years before Europe's age of exploration began. And China's emperor paid to build a flotilla of as many as 300 vessels, some of them more than 5 times the size of Columbus's ships. You see a little tiny ship down there with the red flags? That's the size of Columbus's ship compared to the size of China's ships in the same century. And China's ships were able to carry tens of thousands of men on each one. And Zheng He made 7 naval expeditions, which he called treasure voyages, all around the Malay Peninsula, around India, all the way to the coast of Africa, following existing trade routes. But here's my point about this. Although Zheng He was a military officer, his intention was exploring the world and opening up trade routes. And then he sailed home with his men. He did not conquer any country or set up a colony. Think about that. And after he died, a new emperor took charge, and that guy decided to dismantle the whole navy. So China never had a super strong navy again until now. But my point is that China could have built an empire like the British Empire back then, but that just wasn't their goal. Indeed, starting in the age of exploration, European countries, which we see here in black, vied with each other to create colonies and global empires. Everything in this map, and the bright colors, was a land that was colonized by one European country or another. And by 1900, the Europeans and Japan had conquered well over half the world. Notice there's not much left in gray that wasn't colonized. But by contrast, throughout history, China did have so-called tributary states, smaller Asian neighbors who would bring gifts to the emperor, and then the emperor would send gifts back. But China didn't colonize in the same sense that the British did. And China did expand its borders into Tibet and Mongolia and Xinjiang. That's true. But it never sailed overseas and seized colonies far from its homeland, as Spain and Britain did. So in the future, China may prove to be no better than all of those European and American rivals. But I would argue that the Chinese just don't see the world in the same way Western powers do. They want to rebuild their country to be the much admired power that China once was. And yes, they want to get back territory that they believe was taken from them. Plus, they're working to revamp the international system so that it's not so slanted in favor of the West. But projecting their military power throughout the world isn't in their DNA. Maybe I'm wrong, but let's watch and see. That leads directly to the final question, which is China likely to be the next superpower? And does it aspire to be a military superpower like the US? So let's just get some perspective on this first. Some of our thought leaders in Washington are convinced that Beijing is trying to replace the US as the world's dominant superpower, projecting its power. But the evidence is not yet in. The US has about 177,000 active duty troops serving in 80 countries around the world. It has soldiers stationed on bases in every continent, which is more than 750 military bases outside the US. So far, China has set up only one actual military base outside what it claims as its own territory. And that is in, anybody know? Djibouti. Good answer. It's in Djibouti to protect oil tankers from attack. And it's stationed roughly 2,000 troops there, and it contributes another few thousand troops to the United Nations peacekeeping forces. That's it for troops abroad. So it is true that Xi Jinping is rapidly building up China's Army, Navy, and Air Force. Many of you have perhaps saw some images of the new weapons systems that they displayed during a big military parade they had a couple of weeks ago. But so far, President Xi is focusing on defense of the homeland, with ships stationed off China's coast and not in faraway lands. This is understandable since China has been many times invaded by sea by foreign powers eager to grab its territory. And this focus on defense shows that Beijing is not acting like a superpower, at least in the way the US is right now. After all, being the world's policeman is a tough job. And frankly, China has enough worries at home. So here's a map that shows China's perspective on defense. Those dotted lines are what the US calls the first and second island chains that US military leaders say can be used to contain China's air and naval forces. So, and the stars show major US military bases, mostly in Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. Most of these bases host missiles that point directly at China. So from China's point of view, that's like two chokers around its neck, potentially blocking Chinese ships, both military and commercial. And as you can imagine, to Beijing, this looks really threatening. About 60% of China's exports travel by sea, so economic security is closely linked to the stability of maritime routes. So that's why Chinese care so much about the South China Sea and the East China Sea. They don't want the US Navy to be able to block the sea lanes off their coast. And in fact, the US military has for decades identified choke points along China's coast. Those are those blue areas where islands are close together. And the strategy is if we could block those choke points, the US and allied forces could prevent Chinese ships, military and civilian, from getting in and out. So try to imagine if China surrounded the US with military bases and talked about plans to choke off our international trade. The US claims that China's goal is to be a regional superpower in Asia to control its neighbors. And from Beijing's perspective, China wants to defend its homeland and vital sea routes from hostile forces stationed just 500 or 1,000 miles off its coast. So what does China want? So some Americans have accused it of trying to reshape international rules to fit its needs, and of economic coercion by flooding markets with cheap goods, of military coercion in the South China Sea. And given the facts, I contend that this view is vastly exaggerated. Since 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, Beijing did step up its participation in United Nations agencies, taking leadership of many of them, and it has pushed for bigger roles for emerging countries and less dominance by the US and Western Europe. Beijing wants to work within the UN system with power commensurate with its economic size. But what about all this talk about a multipolar world? Is China trying to create a bloc of countries to oppose the US? So it's true that Beijing strongly supports this organization called BRICS, which is named after the first 5 members: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Africa. And BRICS now includes 10 countries and offers diplomatic coordination forum and economic support for countries, mostly from the global south. And I describe it as an informal club. It's not an alliance whose high level, but it's sort of a club where the high level leaders meet regularly and coordinate multilateral policies, similar to the G7. So, like other BRICS countries, China advocates for a multipolar world where power and influence are distributed among many nations rather than concentrated in a single dominant power. So, what might that mean in today's political climate? So, in the last 6 years, China's leaders have strengthened their position to achieve a stronger hand in trade negotiations, and they've increased their exports to other countries, so they're not so dependent on sales just to the US. And they secured supplies of key minerals needed for defense and high tech. Also, they're working to achieve their goal of self-reliance in many different high technologies. So they say their goal is to be prosperous, strong, culturally advanced, and harmonious in a multipolar world. But they don't mention the word superpower. So whatever happens in China's relations with the US and other Western countries, it remains important for us to remember what drives China, its core values. So stability, strong central government, harmony, pride, and coexistence and non-intervention. President Xi Jinping's top priority is to continue China's growth to ensure stability and prosperity for his people. Which brings us full circle to that promise made by Mr. Deng 40 years ago, stability and prosperity. If that is Beijing's top goal, based on its history and its values, my personal view remains that it's time for Western countries to stop treating China as an enemy. If we treat them instead as a strategic competitor and watch carefully what they say and do, instead of imagining what we would do if we were in their place, I think there's a better chance that we'll find a way to live together in peace. So that's it for my talk, but if anyone would like to talk to me personally afterwards, there's another event here in the theater, so I'm going to pick up my computer and go stand in the back. But I appreciate your patience. Thanks.